1986's Mutant Massacre began the era of at least one X-Men crossover per year, and in late 1990 into early 1991, the X-Men line of comics entered the Xtinction Agenda, spread across Uncanny X-Men, New Mutants, and X-Factor. X-Tinction Agenda follows up on the introduction of Genosha and X-Men 235 to 238, a fictional Marvel nation enjoying fiscal and technological success on the back of an economy built on subjugating, imprisoning, and experimenting on mutant and X-gene potential individuals. The villainous merger of Cameron Hodge and the Genoshan government bring basically all the working mutant forces to Genosha for an event-sized reckoning. Today I'll answer: what happens in Xtinction Agenda, and what's the event's relevance today? Where this event fits in the final stages of writer Chris Claremont's X-verse, and how it symbolizes the changing creative forces of the image revolution in Marvel Comics, and of course the history of Genosha and theories for where the nation fits in X-Men Comics today. Hey everybody, I'm Dave Busing, founder and editor-in-chief of comicbookherald.com. You are listening to Krakin Krakoa number 178. If you like the Comic Book Herald YouTube channel, please consider liking, subscribing, sharing, and commenting. It all helps me out a great deal. You can find full X-Men reading orders, including the full Chris Claremont verse, including reading order for Xtinction Agenda, over on comicbookherald.com with links in the show notes. Some spoilers for Discuss Comics will follow. The introduction to Genosha by Chris Claremont, Rick Leonardi, P. Craig Russell, and Mark Silvestri is set during the Australian Outback era of X-Men, when the team is believed dead by the world post-fall of mutants, and before the events of Inferno in many ways concludes the story of the Claremont-verse X-Men of the 1980s. You could argue, and I likely would, that Genosha is the final major addition Claremont contributes to the lore of X-Men, extending the fear and hate driving mutant persecution to an entire nation set off the east coast of Africa, near Madagascar. And the extended metaphor is a nation literally built into a green and pleasant land on this terribly dark secret that it's all based on subjugating and dehumanizing mutants. Our introduction to Genosha consists of a man's desperate attempts to get his infant son on a plane out of the nation before the Genoshan magistrates, the state's police force, literally gun him down for his attempted escape. Genoshan mutants are considered property of Genosha. They are legally not allowed to immigrate without forceful return to the island by the magistrates, in particular the press gang. Now, here's a quote from the Wikipedia: "The gene engineer, stripped of free will and makes the mutants into mutates, a Marvel term for genetically modified individuals as opposed to those who develop mutant powers naturally. The gene engineer was also capable of modifying certain mutant abilities in order to fulfill specific labor shortages." So not only do we have this police force that subjugates mutants, but we have a Dr. Moreau, a literal Dr. Moreau, Dr. David Moreau, the gene engineer of Genosha, who is converting the population of mutants into mutates, basically, that are easier to control for the island nation. So that's what we're dealing with in Genosha. Now jump ahead a bit in chronology. After Inferno, X-Men comics get especially strange. If not a sense of aimlessness throughout the whole thing, definitely a runway of transition after the build to and execution of Inferno. The Uncanny X-Men roster returns to Australia, but quickly the team is broken up and separated, with Storm turned into a young teenager by Nanny, Wolverine nearly killed by the Reavers before rescue via Jubilee, and the remaining roster of Colossus, Psylocke, Rogue, Dazzler, Havoc. They all pass through the siege perilous and split up with varying degrees of their memories and sense of self retained. There's also an extended storyline during this era following up on the events of the Dazzler the movie graphic novel, which is one of my 10 worst comics of all time, and probably the clearest sign that Claremont was, at least temporarily, grasping desperately at straws with where to take the franchise next. And that's kind of where we are heading into Xtinction Agenda. I think it's fun for continuity buffs and history buffs like myself to sort of see this strange era. I don't know that in the moment it would have been perceived this way. So at its core, Xtinction Agenda is about the Genoshan government seeking revenge on the X-Men for disrupting their sovereign mutate-driven economy, and Genosha gets into bed with a resurrected and more machine-than-man Cameron Hodge to hold the Uncanny Mutants to task for ever daring to defy Genosha. There's a degree of irony in this plot because, as far as I can tell, the X-Men and related teams were perpetually in such a state of disarray that after their first narrow escape from Genosha, I don't think there were even particularly clear plans to upend the anti-mutant nation. Like, Genosha probably could have just kept on carrying on if they didn't keep insisting on taking mutants prisoner and bringing the X-Men to their doors. Now, this event crosses over between the issues of Uncanny X-Men number 270 to 272 X Factor number 60 to 62, and New Mutants number 95 to 97. Okay, so all things considered, it's a fairly tidy crossover, at least by today's standards, all contained within the X line. Again, split between Uncanny X-Men, written by Chris Claremont with art by Jim Lee, New Mutants, written by Louise Simonson with art by Rob Liefeld, an up-and-coming Rob Liefeld, and then, of course, you have X Factor, still written by Louise Simonson here with art by John Bogdanov, the only one of the artists here not part of kind of, the image revolution of things. Xtinction Agenda does occasionally do good work selling the banality of evil at the heart of this island nation, such as during the public debate involving one Moira McTaggart in her build to the Muir Island saga when she's wearing, this badass leather and a sweet lightning bolt earrings face. I love Moira's lightning bolt earrings face. Definitely need to see that addressed in the contemporary era of Marvel X-Men comics. Now, we see in this conversation between the two that, the mutants by the anti-mutant speaker here, they're branded terrorists for infiltrating Genosha. Remember, the first time around, though, they were on a rescue mission after the magistrates captured Madeline Pryor. So the X-Men mutants, they have not actually invaded Genosha at any point in Marvel Comics history. Again, it's just been the magistrates showing up, taking mutants prisoner, and then the X-Men, again, go on like retaliation missions. Now, we see, I think the horror of Genosha as this nation built on a slave economy of mutants is horrifying enough. I think it sells and it speaks very clearly. One thing that we see frequently throughout Xtinction Agenda, and one of my issues with it, is Cameron Hodge as the main villain of this. I actually think it kind of turns the horror of Genosha into a caricature. I actually think it amplifies the horror of Genosha in ways that it almost doesn't need to when you have this literal, robot spider monster resurrected Cameron Hodge, who we see depicted wildly variant throughout this event, because again, you have three artists doing their take without any real consistent sense of who is Cameron Hodge, what should he look like. And just as a reminder, this is after, in the build to Inferno, in the pages of X Factor, Archangel cut off Cameron Hodge's head for fairly valid reasons. We'll get into it here. But he's been, now he's got a head that is attached, and this is actually done, I think, by Apocalypse. This might be a part of the return of the Simonsons in X-Men Legends, just came out in 2021, as far as kind of how Cameron Hodge got his groove back, okay? But the biggest failing for me of Xtinction Agenda is that the mutants spend far too much time kind of imprisoned in the same locale, leading to some very repetitive prison escapes before finally depowering Hodge and freeing the captured mutants and mutates and making their way out of Genosha, and again calling some attention to sort of the atrocity that is going on there just on a national structural level, which is well worth calling attention to. Okay, so the death of the Gene-Engineer in this story, it does happen. It's there's an effort, I think, by Claremont, by Simonson, to sort of instill some humanity in these characters of Genosha, which on one hand I get, but on the other hand, they are so out and out the villains that it's really not worth the time. The Gene-Engineer in particular, right? This is the individual who, allows for the experimentation and subjugation of the mutates, slave population. And we do get the defeat of Cameron Hodge, the apparent death after he does his sweet tongue tricks on Havoc. Nope, not taking that sentence back. And of course, he's not actually dead because he's a weird cyborg, terrible villain of the X-Men. But, at the end of the day, it's a path to making the mutant population independent again, and likewise that humans no longer are as dependent on mutant slave labor in Genosha. At least that's the theory here, although as we'll see, it's not really how it plays out. In terms of crossover, Xtinction Agenda is interestingly, it's creative, as Marvel solidly into the proto-Image era, with Rob Liefeld increasing his influence on New Mutants since the debut of Cable with Louise Simonson in New Mutants number 87, and Jim Lee consistently on Uncanny X-Men as Marvel's X-Men line approaches 1991's X-Men number 1, best-selling comic of all time, and of course this really transformative moment in terms of what are X-Men comics and who's working on them. Lee's progression of Marvel really becomes notable throughout this event, where the Jim Lee drawn issues of Uncanny are clear, visceral highlights, easily the best looking comics in the line, if you ask me. Xtinction Agenda is very much a passing of the torch event, as it's Claremont's last full X crossover before his final issues in 91's X-Men number 1 to number 3, and it's Louise Simonson's final run on New Mutants and X Factor as well, which she'd been driving for around 5 years. as massively influential and as important as these creators are, it's a pretty lackluster swan song. And I definitely feel around this time that it is time for new energy and creative vision for the franchise. I don't think either of these creators would agree. It's definitely something that they wanted to continue doing, and then we're sort of, not literally pushed out the door, but definitely there were editorial forces saying like, yeah, this new hotness of Jim Lee, of Rob Liefeld selling millions of copies, of Todd McFarlane's Spider-Man selling millions of copies, we're going to go with that, right? As opposed to the old guard of Claremont and Simonson. But there's definitely a case to be made that like they did peak with Inferno, I think, and that was such an effective conclusion, not that they wanted to be pushed out. So again, future Image co-founders Jim Lee and Rob Liefeld drive a majority of the action, and the Lee bits frequently look incredible. There is, of course, this, when I talk about the Image revolution, when I talk about the Image ethos of like kind of what 90s comics will become, there's increased violence, a whole lot of Psylocke, and big old guns at every turn, including in the hands of a whole lot of Psylocke. Now, I think with Lee and Liefeld, definitely like there's this style over substance thing. I think Jim Lee in particular in this event gets a lot better at it. He's a lot better at the pacing, at the plotting, at the substance of a story. But again, a lot of their plotted stories are excuses for vehicles for violence, vehicles for spectacle, and that was selling. That was huge. That got a lot of attention. It got a lot of eyeballs on their art, and it's what allowed them, when they did, merge with Todd McFarlane, Mark Silvestri, Eric Larson, Jim Valentino, and the like, they, to form Image, like they had a following, right? And they followed them from Marvel to Image, and that's what made the launch of Image Comics such a success in 1992. There are a handful of character status changes by the event's end as well here, with Storm aged back to an adult. Okay, so remember, she was aged down to a teenager. She's aged back to an adult. Warlock is killed in this event, which is tragic. And Rain Sinclair is turned into a mind-controlled mutate for a time. She is turned back again, but she does decide to stay in Genosha, where she has to remain in her Wolfsbane form for some time, and that will actually spill over into the pages of the not relaunched, but the creatively assigned X Factor, where Peter David and Larry Stroman will take over. That'll be a plot point in that book as well, okay? So big picture, the event primarily brings all the disparate threads of mutants back together in one location and sets the stage for the grand reunification of the teams in 91's X-Men #1. I mean, I do think it's kind of wild how long like all of mutant kind had been apart. If you read X-Men through this era, they've really separated and just like on their heels so extensively, and this event does set the stage for like, hey, what if we just got them all back together and had the teams and the mutants that everybody knows and loves? Honestly, for my money, Xtinction Agenda is my least favorite X event of this era. I don't think it hits as hard as anything like Mutant Massacre, Fall of the Mutants, and definitely not Inferno. I actually think, ironically, like despite the talent involved here, with the Claremont, with the Jim Lee, I think that as you get into 1992's Executioner song, which is the follow-up event, which was like a rushed sort of desperate attempt to salvage an X-Men story after all those Image creators left the books and Marvel was suddenly without its artist. I like that storyline a lot more, personally. Xtinction Agenda, it's just kind of too repetitive and circuitous, although again, I think the big picture ideas of Genosha, of what it is, are really important to the X-Men mythos. Now, as we see in Marvel Comics post-Xtinction Agenda, the X-Men's increasing destabilization of Genosha drives the nation deeper into years-long civil war and public scrutiny, escalating particularly during 1994's Blood Ties crossover between X-Men and Avengers titles of the time. And we really get a good look and a glimpse here of the again, this destabilization of Genosha. It just, the nation devolves completely into civil war, and it becomes this really sort of unmanageable nation where the UN, kind of from the outside looking in during this era, basically is just looking at it like there's no hope, there's nothing we can do, they will be fighting forever. I think Blood Ties 2 as a crossover, it really highlights how wild it is to have a nation like a Genosha with Avengers in that world, right? And with a team that is, somewhat beholden to the United Nations and to responding to threats in the world, and they're semi-clueless about the actions of the Genoshans until it impacts them, right? Until it impacts the Avengers, and then you have Captain America stepping. There's been a lot of talk, I think, lately about the Avengers talking out of character in books like Children of the Atom, for example, where they are played up as villains, sort of mutant kind, or at least of villains is the wrong word. They're played up as not understanding, as not as empathetic as I think we like to imagine them being. Here's Captain America in 1994 telling Cyclops on Genosha Don't think the mutants have the market cornered on moral outrage over what's happened here. We're here to help. He reacts defensively. He reacts angrily to a very, very specifically mutant problem. This is something we see consistently with Captain America. Typically, he learns from that, but it does happen, right? Now, in Blood Ties, the Civil War is escalated by Fabian Cortez, who is, during this era, he's powered up Magneto as part of the Acolytes. He betrays Magneto, of course, and basically leads to his seeming death. But here, Fabian Cortez is kind of obsessed with Magneto, and we kind of see him striking out at what we knew then as the House of M. He strikes out, he captures Luna, Quicksilver's daughter, which is Magneto's granddaughter, or at least as we understood it at the time, and, he's threatening Magneto's grandchildren as a ploy to strike out. But again, he's really goading on the events of the Civil War in Genosha. We do also get a ton of big Exodus energy in this Blood Ties. If you're curious to read the crossover, if you're curious to read more about Exodus and this character, who's a member of the Quiet Council of Krakoa, and I'm saying this off the cuff, but perhaps the least well-known member, I think, for a lot of readers, because he has this stint in the 90s, which are comics that are not typically held up as, as canonically essential, right, as a lot of the, the Claremont burst stuff. You get a lot of Exodus here, and you get a lot of Exodus speechifying and a pretty decent sense of what his deal is, if that's something you've been missing out on, as, seeing him repeatedly as a member of the Quiet Council of Krakoa. So, after this point, after Blood Ties, Genosha, it's still destable. It's still locked in Civil War. And it all kind of builds to a moment in Magneto War, another X-Men crossover in late 1999, and then carries into 2000 with some miniseries like Magneto Rex and Magneto Dark Seductions, all of which is basically setting the stage for what do we do with Genosha, how do we tie it to Magneto, and kind of how do we potentially quell this Civil War and do something new with the Island Nation, which I actually think are really interesting questions and good questions to be answering. Now, one thing we see in Magneto War, we see Magneto really, after 1991, Magneto settles back into full-on Silver Age supervillain mode in a lot of ways, and we see that continue all the way through Magneto War, where he is trying to figure out, basically, is humanity worth saving? Is humanity worth keeping around? There's an issue here where he literally has a conversation with a construction worker. He just picks an individual at random to be hey, is humanity worth saving? I'll talk to this guy and see how much mutant prejudice he just carries with him. And the guy's doing great until he challenges Magneto to a philosophical debate about would you kill baby Hitler, and not a game to play with Magneto. Not a fun game to play with an individual who survived the Holocaust. Poor choice construction worker on that one. All of that is to say, this builds to a final moment where Genosha is handed over to Magneto by the United Nations. That's how it works. That's how the United Nations does things. They can give documents to magnet-powered villains, and then they own a nation. That is 100%. I checked. That's how it works. And Magneto then owns Genosha. Okay, so he becomes the sovereign ruler of Genosha. As said here, the island nation of Genosha is yours to rule, which is where Genosha lives for a couple years. And it's an interesting... I really like this idea, I have to say, of Magneto owning, because it's what he's kind of always wanted, right? And it's this idea of an island nation just for mutants. And the thing with Magneto, though, is he has to deal with the Civil War first. They don't just kick out all the humans. Okay, it doesn't work that way, at least not initially. But this idea of this is the nation for mutants. It sounds familiar, doesn't it? Right? It sounds familiar in the Krakoa era. That's what Magneto had until E is for Xtinction. Okay, until Grant Morrison, Frank Quitely, they take over New X-Men number 114 to number 116, the kickoff of their run and the destruction of Genosha. Okay, we have Cassandra Nova manipulating and willing one of the Trasks, okay, known for their Sentinel creation, to destroy the population, the 16 million. Made 15 to 16 million mutants of Genosha in one fell swoop with these massive Sentinel creations. And it is meant to be horror. It is meant to be just a catastrophic destruction of mutant kind. And it's something that is absolutely felt to this day. It's something that is it's a huge part of the Hickman era of X-Men. I mean, one of the absolute driving forces is the destruction of Genosha. And, it's to the point where, when you have the Fantastic Four getting together with the X-Men, like in the FF X-Men miniseries written by Chip Zdarsky, you have Ben, Grim, the Thing. He's saying, it sounds like Krakoa is not going to be a safe place because guess what? It's a new Genosha, right? This is part of the lexicon. This is part of the history. And basically for the 2000s, E is for Extinction. It defines what Genosha is, which is it's a grave. It's a mass grave. Even in between E is for Extinction and now, the horrors of Genosha do not stop compiling. This is a house of horrors for mutants in the 2000s. We see in the pages of Magneto in the build to the Axis event of 2014 that the Red Skull, then with the powers of Professor X's brain, believe it or not, he turns Genosha into like concentration camps for mutants, okay, which Magneto goes and has to fight for or fight against, of course. And again, it's just like Genosha is just littered with horrors for all of mutant kind. Which brings us to the most recent iteration of Genosha that we've seen, which came in the Empire X-Men crossover, which was very fun, in which we saw the Scarlet Witch try to atone, again, for her role in House of M, the decimation of mutant kind, right? And to do this, she gathers a bunch of mystical artifacts, and she seeks to resurrect the mutants of Genosha, okay? And what actually happens, unfortunately, for Wanda, is they're resurrected, but they're resurrected as zombies. And we then get a zombie versus Plants vs. Mutants all-out battle royale on the island nation, and of course it doesn't go as planned. But there is this idea at the heart of the Krakoa era of X-Men here to that like resurrecting all of Genosha is one of the most important things that mutants can do right now. There's still a possible major play here to resurrect the fallen of Genosha in mass, but through Krakoan resurrection protocols to do it properly, right? Instead of Wanda's spell gone awry, right? So, like, as for the question, what does Krakoa, what does the Hickman era of X-Men do with Genosha? I think, it's a mass resurrection, and this would very much feel like something that would tie into the reign of X, which is the current contemporary era we're in. So again, we went House of X, Powers of 10. That led us to the Dawn of X. Now we're in the Reign of X. And if you're going to call it the Reign, R-E-I-G-N, you're going to call it mutants, superior and sort of reigning over the world or the galaxy or what have you. Resurrecting Genosha definitely feels like it could be a major part of that. One big question I have is, does Professor X's Cerebro have backups of all the mutants of Genosha? We saw recently, actually, in Marauders number 20, that Sebastian Shaw talks about wanting to resurrect Lord Chantal and saying that she was killed before Cerebro backups came online. So there is a before point for Cerebro backups. Does Genosha fit into that? I don't know offhand, but if it doesn't, that definitely seems like the sort of thing they could be plotting and planning to bring all those mutants back. Another potential theory here is if you're reading Children of the Atom, series written by Vita Ayala with art by Bernard Chang, there's a question right now. The Children of the Atom, they are masquerading as mutants, it would seem. They cannot use Krakoan portals, which are only for mutants, okay? When they walk through these gates, they do not go to Krakoa, which tells us they are not mutants. That is how that is supposed to work. The only other mutant we've seen try to use a Krakoan gate and fail is Kate Pride, who walks into them, doesn't pass through them. Her powers just wig out and she can't go through it. And we've also seen it with Franklin Richards, okay? But that's a whole other story, and I've done a video on it. But with the Children of the Atom, the question is, okay, why do they think they're mutants? It's a whole big conversation. But one possible theory, one possible connection to Genosha, what if they're kind of like products of the gene engineer? Mutates. What if their DNA has been altered in some way? They've been engineered as mutates, and they whether it's direct connection to Genosha or just sort of that technology and that legacy, they are mutants in everything but just the way their DNA manifests right now. They were absolutely born that way, but they were tampered with. They were experimented on. That's a book where we see sort of experimentation on potential mutant beings going on there. So a possibility for what could be going on there in Children of the Atom that ties back to the legacy of Genosha as well. So there you have it. X-Tinction Agenda, massive history of Genosha. Hope that was helpful. Hope you enjoyed. Again, I'm Dave. You can support the site. You can support the channel over at patreon.com/comicbookherald. It is greatly appreciated. Thank you to those of you in the mysterious benefactors tier in particular for your generous support. You get your name read here on the video. Thank you, Jesse W., Megan Getman, Cole Weathers, Martin Lopez, Chris Isidro, Brent Bowser, Professor X3769, Richard Renz, Verisimilitude, Terra Nort, Ed Mackey, Clyde to Glide, Pinball Drew, Mike Solomons, Matt Mahoney, and John Samander. I'm Dave. You can find my stuff at comicbookherald.com, at Comic Book Herald on social. Look for the best comics ever in my Marvelous Year podcast for more from me. Thanks, everybody, for listening, and as always, enjoy the comics.